Hello everyone, my name is ProRM Daddy. Welcome to this learning session. Um, this is another session wherein it is related to Power Automate, but the scenario was a little different. The customer have a Power BI table, and in his scenario in the data set there are multiple tables, but there's one specific table which comes from a SharePoint list. And what he wanted to do was within his report, he wanted to refresh that that table. And the idea was that can we refresh or can we initiate the refresh from the Power Automate within the same report using the same data set in general, right? So this was the use case, and we were brainstorming on some of the ideas which we can implement. And one was, what if we use the refresh data set um, connector, which we have built into Power Automate. And just to show you what do I mean by that, if I go to edit in this specific case, and if you haven't seen how to create a Cloudflow, you can probably look at my previous video. But if you look at this one, and if we click on edit, you'd actually see that there is two-step process. One is the click event, which is by default generated by Power BI whenever we add this Power Automate window. The second one was this refresh a data set. And this is using inbuilt connector. And this connector is actually allowing us to specify what is my workspace and what is my data set, and it will refresh that data set. But this wasn't the solution which my customer was looking, because he doesn't want to refresh the entire data set, because the entire data set may take, let's say, a couple of minutes to refresh versus one single table, because this was from a SharePoint list. So that's where we started exploring what are the different ways we can probably implement this solution. And recently, Chris Webb, um, one of the PM in Power BI team, have blogged about how do we implement such a thing using Power Automate. And just to take you through that web um, or that website, this is the Chris Webb personal website, wherein he basically talks about how do we use the refresh API. There is part one and part two to it. The part two was the one which was very related to our case, wherein it actually is having a way wherein we can specify a table name, or even to a granularity of a specific partition which we want to process. So I would highly recommend that you go through this website, because all the things which I am going to show is actually from this website, which I learned overall. Um, Now, if we look at this walkthrough, uh, right, it starts with what we call as a custom connector in Power Apps, or in Power Automate, sorry. And if I go to, in this specific case, let's say my Microsoft Office, and if I go to Power Automate, this is how you will actually go to the Power Automate window. And if we look at the Data Hub and the custom connector, this is where we have to create what we call a custom connector. Because as we saw with this flow, we need a connector which actually allows us to uh, let's say perform the operation which we need, right? So in this specific case, there is no default connector which allow us to process a specific table. And that's where we need to create a custom connector. The name sounds overwhelming, and there is a couple of steps, but if we set it up once, you'd see that it becomes very easy to extend it. And that's something which I learned overall today. So if you look at the way we connect, or we create a custom connector, we start with this new custom connector, and let's say create from blank. And we can specify a name. Let's say this is my refresh data set um, API, right? And if I click on continue, you'd actually see that it asks us to specify what is this connector about and what API we would use. And we know that we would use the api.powerbi.com, right? That's the That's the API which we want to use, right? And this is our base URL. The second one is where, since it is a connector which should require us to, let's say, run certain APIs, in this specific case, the refresh API, we need a way to authenticate against Power BI, right? That api.powerbi.com, which we saw in the previous screen. And we know that we need OAuth 2 to be able to generate the token and get appropriate access. Now, this is where there is a learning curve overall, because when we look at how do we generate OAuth 2 token, you'll see that there are different ways the identity provider can be chosen. And in our case, it is the Azure Active Directory based, right? And we need a client ID and a secret, which we would be using to, let's say, to connect, right, to the app.powerbi.com. And again, Chris Webb actually does talk about this in his part one series. And if I show you what that part one series looks like, you'll see in part one series, he did talk about another web reference wherein um, this gentleman actually have documented step by step on how do we get this done, right? But the main part which even Chris Webb actually highlights here is that now our setup of the embedding environment, which is where generally we create a service principal or the SPN, which we will be using like that client ID and the password or the secret, right? So since it will be embedding for our organization, we can actually select this option, and it then asks us to sign in. And once you sign in to your account, it actually asks us to specify what name do you want to give your application to, and what will be your home page URL. And one thing which I would say is look at this option, which is use a custom URL. This is where you would notice that um, this guidance is being provided, that you will have to make sure that the redirect URL you choose is this one. And this is important to note over here. And the next thing which is very important is what kind of, let's say, work which we would be doing with this API, right? And in our case, we were actually thinking about um, writing or refreshing a data set, right? So we have to make sure that it has access to read and write all the data sets, right? Or you could select all in this specific case and register. In my case, I have already done that, and this is the first step which we will have to do to make sure we have our user ID and the client ID and the secret, which was actually required when we went here to create um, a custom connector, right? And after this, one another important thing which you would see is this redirect URL. At the very beginning, when we create the the custom connector, this URL will be blank. This generally means that this one will be auto-populated once we create the custom connector, and this would be required to be updated into the SPN redirect URL, and that's something which I'll show you in a bit. But if I show you my existing connector, right, and I can cancel this for now, and I can say okay, and I can show you my existing connector by clicking on here. And this is what I was saying, that app.powerbi.com. And in the security, once you go back to this screen, it allows us to edit it. So it came back to, again, asking for all this detail, right? But this is the part which I was actually trying to highlight, that this is one thing which once you create, get auto-populated, right? And you need this at a later stage, right? So once this part is done, and when we go to definition, this is where you actually specify that what is the ID which a user would see when they would actually use this custom connector. And also what is the request. Now this is where the guidance which even Chris and the other gentleman actually specify is you use this import from sample, and you use the data, or you use the API which you want to actually implement, right? So in this specific case, our API was this data set refresh, right? And if I copy this And if I go back to this, right, um, this is the one. I know that this is a post and then the URL, right? One thing I made a mistake at the beginning is when I copy, I see this post was already there and I didn't notice that, and my connector was keep failing with 404. But I had to remove this, and then once I remove it, this is the URL, right? This is the API, actual Power BI API, which we need to call. Now, whenever we call an API, we do need a request body. And this is where you'd see Chris actually specifies this request body over here saying, this is the request body you can actually pass. Now, one thing to remember is this is actually being documented in the same Power BI API saying that, what is the commit mode, what is max parallelism, and also what is the retry and what is the type, right? Like type in this specific case would be whether I want to do a full refresh versus, let's say, automatic, refresh calculate, clear value, and data only, right? These are something which you would see from Power BI screen. You won't see it, right? Just refresh, right? So this is another good way of using the API. Now, if I go back to our let's say this request body, and this is just a sample. So it means that you're just specifying a way which contains what all parameter a user can override, like type, commit mode, max parallelism, and then table partition. And you see another table. This is a way to say that when we have an object, you can either pass a table along with partition, or you can just pass a table name, right, when you're refreshing. And once you click on this, and then if you click on import, you'll actually see this screen which we have over here. Now, one thing which I learned while working with the customer is when we click on this request body, you'd actually see all the parameter which we specified with that sample, right? And you can actually specify some of them as a default value. As an example, what if I want the type uh, to be called as type, uh, and the default value should always be full, as an example, which means that this one is something which will auto populate, right? So that the user doesn't have to type in all these parameter every time, right? And especially as an example, max parallelism, maybe I want the max parallelism to be actually always, let's say 2, right? But remember that this max parallelism depend upon what premium capacity you're using and how many tables you're trying to process. And this is also a overall learning. But if you're trying to process one table, a max parallelism of 2, if there is only one partition makes sense. But if it is more, then you may want to think about this. Uh, but overall, this is how you specify the default values for a given parameter so that the user doesn't have to override them, right? And that's all you have to do. And you just have to click on, for the first time, create connector, or in this specific case, update connector. But as I was saying, once you click on update connector, you will have to go back to the security and make sure that you copy this redirect URL. And you will have to go to your Azure Active Directory. And this is my service principal, which I have created. And under authentication, you'd actually have to add this URI from that custom connector into the redirect URIs. And this is an important step. And once you add this, then your custom connector is all good and you're ready to move to the next one. Now, you may be thinking that this is way too much, but remember that in the definition, you can actually click new definition and you can probably add one more, uh, let's say API, which you want to use. As an example, what if I want to refresh a data flow, right? Then you can create a data flow API as well over here. So one API with multiple tasks or multiple method in general, right? And this becomes a very good way to organize one custom connector with all the set of operation you actually allow in your TNet, right? So that's it. Once you update the connector, you would see that your connector will be actually available. Like in this specific case, we see the Power BI API basically showing up. But the next thing is, once this is being created, how do we tie it to our data set and how do we refresh it, right? And this is where, let's say if I create a new Power Automate window, and if I click on, let's say edit, and I go into uh, new, and then I specify Instant Cloud Flow, you'll see the first step is always the Power BI button, and the next one would be where we can go into the custom, because we just created a custom connector, and you will see that same Power BI API connector is there. And since I only have one method, which is the Power BI refresh dataset, that's why it shows only refresh dataset here. Now, at this time, I have to specify what is the workspace ID, what is the dataset ID, what is the type, what is the commit mode, what is the max parallelism, what is the retry, and then which table do I want to refresh. Like in this specific case, I may want to refresh this table which we see on the right hand side, right? And the group would be, again, if I go to my Power BI service, and if I look at this specific um, workspace, and if I look at this data set, we know that in the address bar, this is my group or the workspace ID, and this is the dataset ID, right? So I can choose this too, and then I can populate this over here, right? And then I can specify, like as an example, just to make sure this is complete, I can actually copy this and paste it over here. Then I can go into dataset, and I can specify the actual value of my data set, which would be this guy, and then type, as we saw, was full, and commit mode was transactional. And if you are not sure about this parameter, as I said, you can actually go into the API documentation, and you can look at the API documentation. Like over here, if I go, I can actually see that we do have commit mode. And if I look at over here, the commit mode is either transactional or partial batch, right? So I can copy transactional, and I can go back to my commit mode over here, max parallelism, as I said, 2, and this is my PBI test. And that's it. If I click on save, I'm all done. And at this time, I can name this differently. I may call this as, let's say, uh, refresh test, right? Automate. Um, and once I click on save and apply, you'll see you'll be redirected to this window, and that's where you click on apply. And now you are ready to run. And you see now I have 1, 2, 3. But the main point which I was trying to show in this demo was how do we integrate it, right? And and this is just initiating of the refresh API, right? It's not going to wait for anything. And what do I mean by that is if I go into my report, which exists right now, like this automate test, and if I click on this, it will just show triggering and triggered, right? You don't know whether it failed, whether it succeeded, and that's where you'll see that there are some additional, um, let's say, blog which Chris Webb have written, wherein he has documented how do we get a um, refresh status and how do we report, right, those status. But in my case, if I want to basically see, I could actually go to refresh history of this particular data set by going to the settings. And if I go to refresh history, I can see what is the status of the refresh history, and it shows that it failed, right? But overall, you'd see it also have succeeded in past. And the main point which we have to highlight is this one, which is via enhanced API, right? And I know why it is failing, because one very important thing which you need to remember is that this workspace has to be a premium workspace, right? And if it is not a premium workspace, then you'll see that um, this Power Automate will not work. And I have paused my premium capacity just to make sure that I don't get charged. So that's why the refresh failed. But overall, that's all it requires. I hope this was useful. Thank you.